Even though all three men were unquestionably brilliant, their coming together was an unlikely event. The oldest and most prestigious was a Greek bishop who had fled Constantinople from the oncoming Turks. The most learned was a humanities scholar and poet whose abiding interest in astronomy had led him to become the world's foremost expert on Ptolemy. The youngest and most gifted was a boy from King's Mountain, just over the Austrian border, who had come to master everything his teacher had taught him, and whose notes were now the most sought-after work in the astronomical community. Who knows how all three initially met? Perhaps at a formal dinner in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. Maybe the bishop had gone to the scholar to have his horoscope read. Perhaps the bishop had heard of the astronomical instruments of exceptional quality being produced by the master and his student. Whatever the circumstances of the initial encounter, the three men's destinies would soon intertwine to produce one of the greatest works of European astronomy, one that would be the spark to light the fuse of a revolution. From the classrooms of the University of Vienna and the halls of the court of Frederick III, to the streets and libraries of Rome, and then finally to the workshops of Nuremberg, Georg Peuerbach, Johannes Muller, and Basilios Bessarion would be responsible for the creation of the Epitome of the Alchemist, and the world's first successful printing press devoted explicitly to scientific publication. And while their astronomical work would soon be superseded, it would form the crucial link between the medieval past and the modern future.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 12.2, Supplemental. The Master, the Student, and the Cardinal. So, as I began to prepare for the episode on Copernicus and the beginning of the scientific revolution, I realized that there was more I wanted to tell about these three figures in scientific history. One of my goals when I set out to do this podcast was to look at the lesser-known figures whose contribution to the narrative are often overlooked, but who are key contributors along the path of discovery, even when the work they did turned out to be wrong. As is often the case, it is only once a hypothesis, model, or theory is clearly understood in all of its details that its shortcomings become well enough understood that they can lead to something new, either through the modification of the hypothesis or by a complete overhaul of it. This episode is a discussion of what had to happen so that the centuries-old model of Ptolemy could be well enough understood by the astronomers and natural philosophers of Europe for that process to take place. Without the epitome of the alchemist, it seems pretty unlikely that Copernicus would have been able to spark the revolution he is so well known for. The figure that we want to start with is a man by the name of Georg Peuerbach. Born in the Austrian village of Peuerbach on May 30th, 1423, we really don't know all that much about his youth, which is something that's often the case during this period of time. What we do know is that he took a somewhat unusual path into academia. As we mentioned in an earlier episode, the usual course for a student was to enter into the university at a pretty early age, usually around 13 or 14 years, in order to study the subjects of the trivium, prior to beginning the university experience in earnest with the study of the quadrivium beginning at around age 16 or so. George, in contrast, didn't enroll at the University of Vienna until he was 23. In the years in between, we have a record of him traveling to Italy, where he explored northern Italy, absorbing the new humanistically centered learning and worldview there, and then living for a time in Rome with one Nicholas Cusanus. It is during this time that he was introduced to some of the leading mathematicians of the day, including Giovanni Bianchini and Paolo Toscanelli. As a side note, Toscanelli is probably best known as the cartographer who wrote a letter to the Portuguese crown, advising them against throwing money away on the harebrained scheme of an Italian navigator who had the plan of sailing west to arrive at the Spice Islands. It was during these years that Allenpak likely absorbed the spirit of the burgeoning Italian Renaissance, and thus set out on that path of becoming the most storied of the 15th and 16th century figures, the Renaissance man. The circle that Cusanus traveled in would have exposed George to all of the subjects of the curriculum in a way that would have shown their integration as well as their specialization. And it would have been through those mathematicians that the young man would likely have encountered astronomy, first in the most rigorous of ways. Upon his return to Austria in around 1446, George enrolled in the University of Vienna, as I said, at that old age of 23. In this, he would have been nearly as old as some of the youngest masters at the university, something that I imagine would have created a rather interesting dynamic, especially given his unique and varied background due to his time in Italy. As was common in such environments, George adopted his birthplace as his last name, and so becomes known as George of Peuerbach, or, in later references, just Peuerbach. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in 1448, and was awarded his Master of Arts in 1451. But interestingly, his focus was not in either mathematics or astronomy, but in dialectic and poetics. However, during this 3-year period over which he earned that master's, he did spend a good bit of time traveling around both Austria and Italy, giving lectures on astronomy and mathematics. In 1453, the same year that Constantinople fell, he was hired by his alma mater to teach subjects in the classics curriculum, including Virgil's Aeneid, as well as other Latin poetry. By all accounts, he was very good at both, but in the very next year, a significant shift in his teaching would occur. One of the shortcomings of many of these newer universities in Central and Northern Europe at this time is that they didn't have large enough faculties to have a master for each and every subject. In Vienna at that time, there was no dedicated professor of astronomy. The subject would likely have been rotated through any number of the arts faculty, with a possible emphasis given to whatever mathematics faculty happened to be in residence at any given time. As you might imagine, this would have produced a somewhat spotty coverage of the subject that had a really strong reliance on those early texts dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries, the ones that were easier to understand even as they were fairly incomplete. Because of his background in astronomy and mathematics from his years in Italy, Peuerbach knew those problems in the astronomy curriculum and had likely been studying Girard's Latin translation of the Almagest on his own. His more informal training prior to starting his degree would have taught him a number of the mathematical tools not available to a lot of the other scholars, and that's probably because his younger and more agile mind was able to master the newer notations and methodologies more readily than those more deeply invested in older forms. Thus, even while being a student at the university, he may well have had the necessary tools needed to work through the various calculations of the Almagest and mastered them. And so it was in 1454 he offered to teach the astronomy course at Vienna. In doing so, though, he decided to rectify the errors in the primary text for the course, the book that we've talked about in the past called the Theorica Planetarum. It is here that we need to spend a bit of time to expand on our earlier comments regarding the state of the model of the universe at this time, at least in Europe. As we said, there had been two models, one by Aristotle and the other by Ptolemy, that had come into the scholastic institutions due to the translation of Islamic documents. The Aristotelian model worked with the physics of the time, but couldn't produce the actual motions of the planets, while the Ptolemaic model could produce the motions of the planets really well, but was more complicated in some ways, or at least we should say, maybe a better way to say that, it was harder to master, and it violated the Aristotelian worldviews in a lot of different ways, both big and small. In astronomy, conserved with saving the appearances, as it were, scholars tended to focus on the Ptolemaic model to produce the various tables of planetary positions. The natural philosophers, on the other hand, wanted to preserve some sense of the cosmology and physics of Aristotle. As such, there came to be sort of a hybrid of the two models that preserved the mechanics of Ptolemy and enough of the structure of Aristotle that the natural philosophers could say that his celestial physics was still more or less working, at least as long as you didn't look too closely at it. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but let me see if I can give us sort of a brief description of the model for a single planet such as Mars. Initially, the very earliest versions of this, what would be said is that there were two concentric spheres for Mars, an inner sphere and an outer sphere, both made of something like condensed ether, so they would be a little bit like crystal. The planet would move on an epicycle between these two spheres. Maybe you can imagine this epicyclic sphere as being something like a marble rolling through a circular tube that's laying on a table. And the tube would be rotating as well. And then what you want to do is think of the planet as being attached to that epicycle in some way. I know it's kind of a complicated model, but the idea here is that you had a whole bunch of spheres turning that would kind of move around the Earth, at least in some sense, in the way that Aristotle would have liked. And then what you have to sort of think about is that each of the planets, each of the 7 planets, would have a set of these. And so the earliest versions of this, which was the one that one would find in the Theorica Planetarum, the Earth would be at the center of all of these spheres. Now, as the model needs to be refined, it goes through all of the same steps that we talked about that the Ptolemaic model had gone through centuries earlier in order to get better and better predictions of actual planetary behavior. These changes, these refinements, included the Earth being first shifted off of the center of the spheres by a certain amount, something you may recall being called the eccentric. By the time of Peuerbach, there was an understanding that this model and all of the little modifications that went on with it really needed some updating. There were a number of issues with the model that needed to be corrected or at least reconciled with the data. And so it was that in his 1454 lectures, Peuerbach set out to do this using both the Almagest and Al-Hatham's work as guides. And this is where our second figure really comes into the stage. Johannes Muller was a precocious young man from the Bavarian city of Königsberg. By the way, don't confuse that with the city of the same name in East Prussia. He had been born on June 6th, 1436, and again, his early life is more or less beneath the purview of biographers and historians. However, at age 11, we know that he enrolled at the University of Leipzig, where he studied the trivium. Before we move on here, I want you to take just a moment to think about this. Here's this 11-year-old kid leaving his home and going to a university town to study all by himself. No parents, no siblings, no other relatives that we know of. What kind of intelligence and maturity did it take for him to not only survive, but to succeed and thrive? If you're a fan of the TV show Big Bang Theory, this kid is basically, or was basically, Sheldon Cooper, but in like the 15th century. And by the way, as we'll see, the Sheldon Cooper comparisons aren't going to stop there. After mastering the trivium, he moved to the University of Vienna in 1451 and earned his Bachelor of Arts a year later at the age of 15. At this point, he enrolls in the Master of Arts program and somewhere along the line in the next couple of years meets Peuerbach. Now, I can't really imagine two people with a more different set of life experiences. Peuerbach is relatively well-traveled, grounded in the humanist movement through an informal exposure to the ideas of that movement by the men doing the work in that movement. He started his formal schooling late and was teaching from time to time in a field that he actually hadn't formally trained in. Muller, on the other hand, was a young wunderkind whose mind possessed a laser-like focus on a few very specific subjects. He hadn't really traveled, and his learning was completely within the scholastic university type of a system. The thing that brought the two together seems to have been their shared love for mathematics and astronomy. When Peuerbach was hired in Vienna, Muller, now taking the name of Johannes de Regio Monte, became his student. When Peuerbach was given the astronomy course in 1454, Regio Monte took the course and devoted himself to taking the best possible notes from the lectures and those supplemental class meetings, the things like disputations. These notes would become the basis for a new manuscript on astronomy that put forward what would be the most well-elaborated version of that hybrid model of the universe. This manuscript, known as Theoria Planetarum Novea, or just the new theory of the planets, was so thorough in its coverage that for the next 2 centuries it would be considered the definitive description of the model, and the manuscript, as it spread from one scholar to another, rapidly became the standard astronomy text in Europe. One thing that should be noted, however, is that the new in the title didn't mean or doesn't mean that the planetary theory was truly new or original, but rather that it was a new presentation of the older theory that corrected many of its flaws and shortcomings. While the work was based foremost on the research of Peuerbach, Regio Monte's contributions were so important to its completion and so valuable in getting things organized that it really should be considered as a collaboration between a master astronomer and his rapidly progressing apprentice. In the same year as he was giving his lectures, Peuerbach was also appointed the court astrologer to the 14-year-old King Ladislaus V of Hungary and Bohemia. This is the period of European history when astrology holds a significant place in what we might think of as the work of science, much as alchemy did. Like alchemy, astrology was filled with all sorts of arcane information and notation, but it should be understood that it also served an important role in the development of astronomy due to its requirement of both good observations of the positions of the planets and good timekeeping. Also important in this, Peuerbach would get to know Ladislaus's cousin and guardian, Frederick. In a few years, Frederick would take a big step up in the world of European politics when he would be elected as Holy Roman Emperor. When he too needed a court astrologer, you can guess who got the call. And this would happen in 1457 when Ladislaus was forced to flee Vienna after 2 nobles close to him were assassinated. In the years between 1454 and 1460, Peuerbach and Regio Monte would undertake a number of projects, both together and separately. Peuerbach would publish the first set of sign tables in Europe, a mathematical advancement that would allow him to replace an older and harder calculational method Ptolemy had used. The two men together collaborated on the design and construction of various astronomical instruments, which were about the best constructed at the time. In 1457, the year Regio Monte received his Master of Arts degree, he and Peuerbach observed an eclipse that occurred about 8 minutes earlier than the Alphonsine tables had said it would. These tables, now in use for over 200 years, were slowly getting more and more out of whack with what was actually occurring in the heavens. Peuerbach and Regio Monte set out to construct a new set of eclipse tables that would substantially update the older work. These would be released in manuscript form in 1459 and would be published in 1519 and would prove to be enormously popular as well. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, and to understand that, we need to look at one of the most interesting and remarkable figures of the late Middle Ages, Cardinal Basilios Bessarion. As a note here, I have to correct an error I made in the last week's episode where I called him Johannes Bessarion. Apparently, this is an error that dates back to the writings of the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Gregory III of Constantinople, and it's been kind of propagated through the literature on and off since as far back as the 1450s. Bessarion was born an Orthodox Christian in 1403 in the Black Sea port of Trebizond, in what was then called Anatolia. At the time, this was still part of the world that was deeply steeped in Greek culture, and so he grew up with a solid grounding in the Greek classics, works that were well known there. He was educated in Constantinople, and at the age of 20 went to the Peloponnese of modern Greece to learn Platonic philosophy. He took the name Bessarion upon becoming a monk in the Orthodox tradition, and in 1436 was made an abbot of a monastery in Constantinople. A year later, he was made the Metropolitan of Nicaea by the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaeologus. And here's where we need to go off on just a little bit of a tangent to understand this guy a little better. Way back in 1065-1066, a series of theological and political differences had built up between the two parts of the Orthodox Catholic Church along lines roughly equivalent to the division of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. The Church in the West had had to survive without political protection for a couple of centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire until its alliance with the Franks, while the Church in the East had been able to create sort of a theocratic government centered around the person of the Byzantine Emperor. The Church in the West had followed more closely the teachings of Ambrose and Augustine, while the Church in the East had adhered more closely to the writings of men like Athanasius. After the last ecumenical councils, these differences had widened until they had fractured over an addition to the creed or the proclamation of faith made by all Christians. It was an addition known as the Filioque. Now, in the intervening 4 centuries, there had been a number of attempts at reunification between the two parts of the church, but these had been more or less completely wrecked by the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. However, by the 15th century, it was clear that the reconstituted Byzantine Empire was too weak to hold off the Ottoman Turks without some help. It needed the newly strong kingdoms of the West to lend men and send aid if there was to be any hope of holding the forces of Islam back. However, the schism, as it was called, really complicated things. The Pope in Rome wanted something in return for his aid. He wanted the reunification of the church under his at least nominal authority, though, truth be told, he likely wanted a whole lot more authority than that. And this is where Bessarion takes his step onto that world stage. In 1439, he was brought by the Byzantine Emperor to Rome to participate in diplomatic talks aimed at bringing the churches back together and obtaining the aid Constantinople needed. Now, given that it's now Istanbul, not Constantinople, and there's still a divided communion, broadly Roman Catholic in the West and Eastern Orthodox in the East, you can probably guess how all of this went. However, due to his central role in the negotiations, he came to the attention of Pope Eugene IV, who appreciated his pro-reconciliation stance and his love of the Greek classics. Upon returning to Constantinople, Bessarion found himself under attack by the anti-reunification forces. The Pope, seeing a chance to drive a wedge between the factions in the last great Roman city, named Bessarion as Cardinal of the Catholic Church and invited him to return to Rome in late 1493, an offer Bessarion accepted. When he moved to Rome, he took with him his extensive library of Greek classics and the humanistic perspective they supported and established something of an academy of humanistic learning and scholarship in his home there. It served also as a refuge for the growing number of Greek refugees, especially after the defeat of the forces of the last crusade at the Battle of Varna, that more or less sealed Constantinople's fate. With the death of Eugene IV in 1447, there came a series of pontiffs who supported and fostered the humanist learning that was giving rise to the Italian Renaissance, and Bessarion and his academy were a central nexus of that movement. Perhaps the most important figure in this was Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who would become known better as Pope Pius II. From the time of his moving to Rome, Bessarion also acted as a negotiator for the Holy See. The 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, but really the 14th and 15th centuries, were a time of great division within the Catholic Church, and Bessarion was often called upon to serve as a diplomat, especially with the various political entities that made up the Holy Roman Empire. It was in this role that he first met Peuerbach and likely Regio Monte. Having traveled to the court of Frederick III to smooth over a conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and a rival, Bessarion somehow came into contact with Peuerbach, and the two likely got to talking shop. Bessarion's philosophical rival in Rome, a guy by the name of Georg Peuerbach, had recently completed a Latin translation of the Almagest, and Bessarion wasn't really impressed with the quality of the work. While his rival had begun with the Greek manuscript of the great text, he didn't handle the mathematics and astronomy well, and so Bessarion was hoping to find someone who could do a better job. While Peuerbach couldn't speak or read Greek, he had by this time practically memorized the Almagest in Latin, and his grasp of the mathematics was absolutely unparalleled. As the two men discussed the topic, Bessarion urged the Viennese master to take on the project of producing a better translation. Peuerbach, however, declined that specific project, saying that another straight translation wasn't really needed. Instead, he pushed the idea of creating an abridgment of the work that would comment on its utility and correctness while also straightening out some of the harder-to-follow parts. Bessarion agreed that this was likely the best path forward, and so commissioned Peuerbach to start the project in 1460. Unfortunately, for all involved, in 1461, a year into the project, and through about 6 of the 13 volumes of the Almagest, Peuerbach took seriously ill, likely with the plague. On his deathbed, he urged Regio Monte to take over the project. The younger man agreed, later writing, quote, "When my teacher was dying, he commanded me to do these chapters as quickly as possible. He was anxious even on his deathbed to fulfill his duties on the Almagest." End quote. When Peuerbach passed, Bessarion's patronage went to his most talented student. However, Regio Monte said he wanted to be able to learn Greek in order to be able to draw from the original Greek manuscripts as well, and so it was that Bessarion took the young man on as a pupil, and 6 months later the two left Vienna for Rome, where Regio Monte would stay for the next 5 years until 1467. As we say goodbye to Herr Peuerbach, let us take a moment to recognize the work he had done before his untimely death at the age of 38. In the 7 years between 1454 and 1461, he had managed to create a description of the heavens that somehow managed to retain the computational accuracy of Ptolemy while meeting enough of the physical requirements of the Aristotelians to allow for the science to once again move forward. He saved the appearances while also supporting the assumptions of celestial physics, something that I can tell you was no mean feat. As a final point, I will quote the work of Tony Christie from his Renaissance Mathematicus blog entry titled, "The Astronomical Revolution Didn't Start Here." He writes, quote, "To close, I would like to mention another aspect of Peuerbach's life and work that usually gets ignored in the works on history of science. Peuerbach is one of the few examples before the 20th century of a scientific scholar who was known to be homosexual. I think this fact should be made public more often to help combat the ignorance and hate that some people feel necessary to pour out against the lesbian and gay community. Peuerbach's partner or lover was a monk who committed suicide, and the heartbroken Peuerbach erected a monument to his dead love in a series of beautiful love poems written in Latin." End quote. Truly, Peuerbach was a Renaissance man of tremendous and varied talents. And while humanity would likely have determined the true nature of the solar system in due time, it is almost certain that such a revolution would have taken a great deal longer had it not been for his commitment to fully understanding Ptolemy's work and his willingness to share that knowledge with the 14-year-old prodigy who became his most gifted student and collaborator. So let us now turn to Rome. During his time there, Regio Monte completed the project entrusted to him in Peuerbach's dying request. In 1462, the Epitome of the Almagest was finished, and it represented the pinnacle of European astronomy. In fact, other than maybe the astronomical work being done by Ulugh Beg at Samarkand, this work represented the pinnacle of astronomical achievement anywhere in the world at this time. It was a work of brilliant summary, commentary, and extension that finally made the Almagest available and understandable to astronomers across the continent. While it wouldn't actually be published until 1496, it would be transmitted via manuscript form, much as Peuerbach's new theory of the planets had been, from student to master to the next round of students over and over again, spread throughout Europe. Much like his teacher, Regio Monte's next work was in the field of mathematics. Published in 1464, De Triangulis Omnimodus, or On Triangles of Every Kind, was a book that focused on the use of trigonometry and triangulation in the measurements of the astronomical positions of the stars and planets, part of a more modern field that we call astrometry. Much of the material of this work may have actually been lifted from a 12th century work by an Andalusian astronomer by the name of Jabir ibn Alfa, but it served as a significant extension of the subject in the European universities. In the introduction to the work, Regio Monte writes, quote, "You, who wish to study great and wondrous things, who wonder about the movement of the stars, must read these theorems about triangles. For no one can bypass the science of triangles and reach a satisfying knowledge of the stars. A new student should neither be frightened nor despair. Good things are worthy of their difficulties, nor should anyone avoid the small volume. It is the foundation for so many excellent things. I do it no injury by calling it the foot of the ladder to the stars." End quote. Shortly after this, he published another text, Algorithmus Demonstratus, one of the first works to do algebra in symbolic form. By the way, have you noticed? The titles of books sound so much cooler in Latin, don't they? Anyway, in the next year, he would build a portable sundial for Pope Paul II. By this time, Regio Monte's reputation as not only the best astronomer of his generation, but as the best scholar in Europe had spread far and wide. And so, in 1467, he accepted an invitation from King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary to join the royal library there. The king was building a repository of the great works of antiquity, especially those written in Greek, and he wanted Regio Monte to curate and work with the collection. And it's here that our most remarkable cardinal now exits the stage, having played his part in our tale. However, there are probably a few more notes that are in order before we take our leave of His Eminence for the remainder of the episode. It is said that on at least one occasion, he was seriously considered for the papacy, as he was thought to be sort of disentangled from most of the infighting within the church's hierarchy that had taken place over the preceding century and a half. While the various powerful factions within the church scuttled the idea, in 1463 he was named the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, a title wrapped up in the ongoing conflict between the two branches of Christianity dating back to that Fourth Crusade. And while Bessarion was never made pope, it can be said that he played the role of pope maker, as he presided over the papal conclaves of 1464 and 1471. In 1465, he created the first printing press in Italy, just outside of Rome. He did this by bringing in two very talented German printers by the name of Schweinheim and Penartz, and commissioning from them a new font, Antiqua, to distinguish the work that was coming from his humanistic school from the output of the more theologically oriented German printing presses. Cardinal Basilios shed his mortal coil on November 19, 1472, while on a diplomatic mission to Ravenna. I have to say that I'm not sure I've run across a more fascinating figure, one who bridged as many cultures and who could be said to have, in a very real sense, midwived the modern age. I wish we had more time to dig into his life in greater detail, but I think that'll probably have to be left to somebody who's a much more talented historian than I am. Regio Monte would remain in Hungary for the next 3 years, writing additional works on trigonometry, publishing a set of important astronomical tables, and building state-of-the-art astrolabes and other astronomical instruments. Perhaps the most illustrative story from this period of his life has to do with what would seem to be, at least at the time, the practice of medicine. Shortly after Regio Monte's arrival in Buda, King Matthias took seriously ill. The king's court fell into a panic, but Regio Monte calmly consulted his astrological tables and told the king's advisors that the illness was due to a temporary weakening of the king's heart due to a recent eclipse, and that the episode would soon pass, something that did indeed transpire. This story illustrates both the integration of astrology with medicine and the pervasiveness within the culture of early modern Europe. The first had to do with the strongly Aristotelian view of medicine at the time. While the theories of Galen and Avicenna tended to dominate much of the specific understanding of the human body and how it worked and how it was influenced by its local environment, there was also a strong belief in the idea of Aristotle's that there was a connection between the micro scale of individual organisms and the macro scale of the universe as a whole. Hence, it was thought that to fully understand the ebbs and flows of the human body, the physician also had to be aware of the changing nature of the heavens, especially as they related to the specific way in which an individual had been initially placed within those ever-changing but predictable cycles of planetary motion. In other words, at this time, the competent physician had to be able to draw up, or at least interpret, a patient's horoscope. As both an astronomer and an astrologer, along with his ability in mathematics and his superior knowledge of many of the Greek texts now making their way into Europe via translation through Bessarion's Academy in Rome, Regio Monte was uniquely able to access the fullness of this tradition. Much of the impetus for his work in mathematics, especially in trigonometry, was due to his desire to provide better tools for the practice of medical astrology, if that can be called such a thing. As might be imagined, it was feats like the quote-unquote correct diagnosis of King Matthias that continued to catapult his reputation into the celestial realms, as it were. Soon, wealthy from his consulting work and desiring to set off on his own projects, he made the decision to move again in 1470. This time, his destination was Nuremberg. So why Nuremberg, rather than one of the more cosmopolitan cities of Central Europe, such as Vienna or Prague? Well, in his words, quote, "Quite recently, I have made observations in the city of Nuremberg, for I have chosen it as my permanent home not only on account of the availability of instruments, particularly the astronomical instruments on which the entire science is based, but also on account of the great ease of all sorts of communication with learned men living everywhere, since this place is regarded as the center of Europe because of the journeys of the merchants." End quote. Nuremberg would remain a center of trade in Europe for hundreds of years, and Regio Monte correctly understood that he could obtain a certain independence from the systems of patronage and never-ending intrigue and jostling for power found in the various noble courts. Upon arriving, he made the acquaintance of one Bernard Walther. Walther was a wealthy merchant of the city, and he sought to occupy his intellect and curiosity beyond the usual matters of trade and commerce. In short order, he became both Regio Monte's patron and student, learning everything he could from the scholar. The two worked to build a state-of-the-art observatory as well as founding a new printing press in the city, the latter taking inspiration from Bessarion's press in Rome, using the same Antiqua typeface and focusing on the printing of scientific work. The two enterprises were both very successful in their own ways. The observatory was situated outside Nuremberg's walls, on a rise with excellent views of the sky. While a number of good measurements were made there, with some of the best instruments constructed up to that time, the most consequential observations made had to do with the comet of 1472. Visible for 59 days from about Christmas of 1471 to the 1st of March of 1472, this comet was really a huge deal. I've seen accounts from Chinese astronomers that said that it was bright enough that it was visible during the daytime. Now, Regio Monte and Walther undertook the project to attempt to determine its distance from the surface of the Earth. I haven't been able to run down the specific method they used, but it may have been the same parallax strategy that had been used all the way back to Aristarchus to estimate the distance to the moon, and that would be used later with such great effect by Tycho Brahe. The biggest limitations they likely would have faced in this attempt to measure this would have been the accuracy of the scales of their measuring instruments. With the tools that they had, they reported that the comet had to be at least 8,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. We know now that this measurement was grossly inaccurate, but it was the first real attempt to measure the distance to one of these, what we would think of now as an astronomical body, in Europe since Hellenistic times, and thus it represented a huge step forward in the astronomy being done. So the interesting thing about this measurement is that even though we know now that it's really, really way too small, one of the things is it was thought to confirm something that Aristotle had said about comets, and that was that they were an atmospheric phenomena. Of course, we would say even at 8,000 miles, well, gee, that would have to be out in space. At the time, it was thought that the spheres of air and fire that made up sort of the outer part of the terrestrial realm would extend all the way out to what we call the lunary sphere, or the sphere of the moon. And so in Aristotle's system, that was farther out than the 8,000 mile number that Regio Monte and Walther had arrived at. And thus it was thought that they had confirmed with their measurement that comets were actually an atmospheric, not an astronomical phenomenon. It wouldn't be until Tycho Brahe that the true distances of cometary motion would actually be accurately known, and we get a much better picture of what was really going on. The other enterprise that the two men engaged in was significantly more successful in its accuracy. Given Regio Monte's unique skill set and the growing ability of Walther, they possessed the ability to do something almost no one else at the time could: publish mathematical and scientific works of unerring accuracy and correctness. Regio Monte had the ability to check any translation and calculation to make sure that they were typeset correctly. He could redo calculations to make sure tables were accurate, and anything coming out of a Greek manuscript was rendered into Latin appropriately. Additionally, Walther had the connections and the experience in the world of trade to acquire the necessary materials at the best possible prices and then distribute the finished books in the best markets, most importantly Nuremberg itself. This ensured that the press was a financially viable enterprise, even given the challenges and increased costs associated with printing scientific works. The first book the two published was Peuerbach's New Theory of Planets, and it was an instant success. The next would be another bestseller, Regio Monte's Ephemerides, that set of tables that we mentioned in the last episode. Following on these successes, the two men put out a list of books they'd like to publish, asking anyone who had manuscripts of them if they'd make them available to be printed. Due to the exacting level of what we would now call quality control, only 4 of the 44 books on the list would be published before Regiomonte was once again called away. In 1475, he was summoned by Pope Sextus IV to Rome to assist with a number of issues, the most important being calendar reform. As a result, he left the printing press and the observatory in the care of the more than competent Walther and traveled to the Eternal City, expecting to stay only for a year or so before returning. Unfortunately, he would emulate his teacher by dying young, likely felled by the plague in 1476. There is, however, another story about this. The scholar Pierre Gassendi, in his autobiography of Regiomonte, says that there was a persistent rumor in Rome that the scholar was assassinated by the sons of a rival astronomer that he had criticized earlier in his life. As we said earlier, Regiomonte was a lot like that fictional genius of the TV show Big Bang Theory, Dr. Sheldon Cooper. He was arrogant and loudly dismissive of what he considered inferior work done by others. When he had been in Rome previously, writing the second half of the Epitome of the Almagest, he had written something that was really quite a withering critique of that most recent Latin translation of the Almagest by Georg Trebizond. Now, protected by Cardinal Basilios, Regiomonte was more or less untouchable at that time, but when he returned in 1475, his sponsor was 3 years in the grave. The rumor has it that Trebizond's sons had Regiomonte poisoned in revenge of their father's humiliation. There is, however, no substantial proof of this story, and 1476 was a year when a wave of the plague hit Rome particularly hard. The loss of Regiomonte was a huge blow for the progress of astronomy as a science in Europe. While Walther continued the printing work the two had begun, and the observatory produced a series of excellent observations for a number of years, there was no equivalent mind to take the observations and make something of them. From the notes we have from Regiomonte's personal effects, we know that he was becoming dissatisfied with the shortcomings of Ptolemy's model. While he wasn't as bothered as some by the use of the equant, he thought that he should be able to get a set of parameters that would bring the Alphonsine tables into better agreement with what was actually being seen in the heavens. However, no matter how hard he had tried, the problem resisted his attempts to resolve it. Beyond this, he was bothered by the ad hoc nature of some of the motions of the model, things which he thought should be readily apparent from the mathematics. As such, he had begun to consider the possibility that Ptolemy's model would require significant revision or even a replacement. Unfortunately, his death prevented him from following up on this supposition, and there would be no one with the talent he had who could take his place. At least not until a young dilettante from the Hanseatic States, who would, like Peuerbach, find himself drawn to astronomy while studying for another thing altogether. But that story will have to wait until next time. As a final note, if you try to look up Johannes Muller or Johannes de Regio Monte, you will likely find him referred to as Regiomontanus. While there is some debate on this, it's unlikely that he ever went by this name in his lifetime. Instead, the name was given to him by Luther's Minister of Education, Philip Melanchthon, in 1534 in a work summarizing the state of astronomy for the Lutheran University in Wittenberg. This title, something more than a name I think, was then incorporated into new editions of Regiomonte's works printed thereafter. Such is the evolution of the names in the late Middle Ages and the early modern age. As we bring this episode to conclusion, I would like to deviate from the normal sorts of endnotes for a couple of comments. First off, let me acknowledge my sources for this episode. The astronomer and historian of science Owen Gingerich has recently released a volume in the very popular Oxford Very Short Introduction series, covering the life of Copernicus that is quite accessible, and he spends some time in it on the astronomical advances that lead up to the man's work. The same is also true in Jack Repchek's biography of Copernicus titled Copernicus's Secret: How the Scientific Revolution Began. I've drawn heavily from Tony Christie's Renaissance Mathematicus blog, as well as James Evans' History and Practice of Ancient Astronomy. All of these sources will continue to be vital to our story going forward. Last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to my colleague, Dr. Todd Timberlake of Berry College, for his helpful comments on the material as I've worked to understand it better. On a more personal message, the week leading up to the release of this episode has been very tumultuous, at least here in the United States, filled with reports of killings and the backlash that always seems to accompany those, perhaps rightly. These issues are complex and difficult to sort through, and involve issues of historical and socioeconomic privilege, the perception and reality of public safety, and the finding of a path through the dizzying array of opinions and attitudes that accompany these things. I don't pretend to be wise enough or separated enough from my own position of enormous privilege to be able to comment on these issues with any true knowledge. I've never been a law enforcement officer, and I don't know what it's like to face the situations they deal with on a day-in and day-out basis. Nor am I a member of a minority group who has faced a long history of oppression and marginalization, and that still must overcome significant institutional and cultural barriers to make their way in the world. What I would like to say is that none of the issues we face will be resolved if we don't all try to get out of the camps and narrow interest groups and niche markets much of the media and business interests seem to want to herd us into. What I would like to ask all of you who listen to this podcast to do is to turn off the talking heads who spin fear to get you to listen to them, and go out and meet with someone who is different than you in some way. Have a cookout in your backyard and invite the neighbor that you haven't talked to in a while. Attend a house of worship that is outside your faith tradition. Go to a different restaurant than the one you usually have lunch at. Look people in the eye and see them as fellow human beings on this journey, and acknowledge that we all basically want the same things out of our lives. Tell them thank you for the work they do, and wish them well in their lives. Talk to them. Maybe avoid the hard topics the first time, but if you can't, seek to listen with a heart to hear their story. I've been a teacher a long time, and I suffer from the somewhat naive belief that when we see each other as humans instead of as objects, things really do go a lot better. In my faith tradition, there is this ideal of making a place for the alien and stranger, of radical hospitality that takes a risk to create a space for grace and peace. It is a path that rejects the myth of redemptive violence for one of sacrifice and service. While it is more than likely that you do not share my faith, I hope that you might be able to see and enact these ideals in your community so that we can bridge this divide that threatens to separate us from each other forever. There's a poem that in the last few days has brought me solace when fear has threatened to overwhelm me. While not written for this particular astronomer and his pupil that we've been talking about, I think it is a fitting way to end our episode, as it speaks to our players in this drama, as well as to the place many of us find ourselves in this week. I hope that you'll bear with my indulgence as I share it with you. The Old Astronomer to His Pupil by Sarah Williams. Reach me down, my Tycho Brahe. I would know him when we meet, when I share my later science, sitting humbly at his feet. He may know the law of all things, yet be ignorant of how we are working to completion, working on from then to now. Pray remember that I leave you all my theory complete, lacking only certain data for your adding, as is meet. And remember, men will scorn it, 'tis original and true, and the obloquy of newness may fall bitterly on you. But my pupil, as my pupil, you have learned the worth of scorn. You have laughed with me at pity. We have joyed to be forlorn. What for us are all distractions of men's fellowship and smiles? What for us the goddess pleasure with her meretriculous smiles? You may tell that German college that their honor comes too late, but they must not waste repentance on the grisly savant's fate. Though my soul may set in darkness, it will rise in perfect light. I have loved the stars too fondly to be fearful of the night. Until next time, full sails on your journey. you.